and kind of go from there. So last week we talked about building a box sizing, and that kind of leads into one of the main aspects of building an interface as well as a grid and the understanding of it. So I'm going to quickly cover that, but again, that was in last week's lesson, and I did post that on YouTube. So Mitch, I'm sorry that you missed that, but I'm going to quickly cover it as fast as I can right now, just so you have a base understanding, and then get into kind of the grid system that I was talking about last week. So box sizing, I'm going to use the star selector, and I'm also going to add the before, and then I'm going to also add the after. So star selector means every single element on the page. So if I were to do something like this, actually, let's do this. And I add this, and I say like outline 1 pixel, oops, solid blue. You'll see at least a couple outlines here, and then if I add like a div inside here, an H1, blah blah blah, span, and more, all those will have an outline. So star selector looks at every single element in the page and adds that to it. And the before and after are pseudo classes, which we have not really covered yet, besides what we will today with clearing a float. But anywho, star selector, I'm going to put box sizing in here. I'm going to put border box. And I'm going to create a div here. Oops, not a dove, a div. And I'm going to put the content at 700 pixels. And I'm going to call this class, oops, I'm going to call it Mitch, just because Mitch missed last week. And I'm going to say Mitch is a width of 700 pixels. And I'm going to give it an outline of 1 pixel solid black. When I right click and I go to inspect using Chrome Inspector, tools, oops. Right click on this, highlight this, it says 700 pixels, right? That is the width here, that is the CSS property, so Mitch is a class is being added here. The selector is .Mitch, which stands for a class, that's the CSS selector, and it's going here. Class is the attribute, it's equal to Mitch right here. The CSS property is width, the value of it is 700 pixels. We also have a second property of CSS, which is outline 1 pixel solid, hashtag 000, which is a shorthand for black. I can also put the phrase black inside here, or as most hex values, they're actually in 6s. But you can shorthand if there's 6 of them in a row to just 3 of them. So that's why it's black here. I also don't need this because it will complete the color, which it's inheriting black from the body, which is the default from the browser. But anyways, this is 700. That's what's exciting here. Let's add a padding of 40 pixels inside here. And you'll notice that there's 40 pixels on the inside, and this guy remains 700 pixels. So what this is doing is, if I remove box sizing, let's add this here. Oops. And change this. If I highlight this now, it's 780. Why this is 780 is because it's saying 40 on the left and the right, on the top and bottom. So top, right, bottom, left, all have 40. 700 is my width. 700 plus 40 on the left side plus another 40 is equal to 80. That's why this is 780. The reason why that happens is in WebKit browsers and modern day browsers, they inherit box sizing as content box. And that is looking at the inner content. So the inner content is 700 pixels. So if I highlight this, you see that green color and then that blue in the middle. That blue in the middle is showing the content box of 700 pixels. So 700 means the content of the width in this case. And the 40 on the each side.
Is that box now 780 pixels?
This box, if I highlight this, it says 780 pixels right up here. This can be confusing because I am imagining that this container is 700 pixels, but it's adding 80 on each side. To fix this, if I add border box sizing border box, highlight this, it's now becoming 700, and now the padding is on the inside. So if I look at this, the inside is 620, so off to the side here. The content is 620, and then the outside inside here is the 40 on each side, which is 80, and then the outside of this is 700. So 700 minus 40 on each side is 620. So my content becomes 620, but this entire container is 700. That's what box sizing does.
So wait, what was it before? This border box now, what was it when the padding was inside the container?
780.
Well, yeah, but what was the code? Oh, okay. You just added border box, and that's what...
Yep.
Okay.
Yep. So that's how it works. So that's important. So getting into the lesson of building an interface. We're going to follow and we're going to create our first grid. I'm going to follow one of my favorite semantics of all time. So I'm going to add a comment block here just so you can have this. And I'll share this in the comment, just like my code from last week I shared in the YouTube video. But I like to do the following breakdown. C dash, and that equals component. O dash is equal to object. T dash is equal to theme. U dash is equal to utility. And I feel like I'm missing one of my underscore, whatever afterwards, so it starts with that, is equal to a hack of some sort. JS dash is equal JavaScript, so it's some JavaScript naming convention. And that's pretty much all the ones that I follow right now. So for example, if I'm creating a grid, that is an object. So I say O-grid. So an object means that it has no stylistic component whatsoever. It is meant only primarily for structural. So it is skinless and it is flexible to meet the needs of the content. A C dash, so again, this is period O dash. So this is a class that is grid, but it starts with this prefix, which is O dash, which means it's an object. And C dash means it's component, T dash means theme, U dash is utility, underscore, whatever follows afterwards is a hack, and JS is a JavaScript. Component dash is something very specific, and it is something that is less reusable, and usually in an application. Components can be used multiple times in an example. Maybe through today you'll see a C dash, but for right now I'm focusing on O dash, which means it's an object and it is not referencing the interface, the design, or the UI of it yet. I'm going to show you multiple ways of building out a grid. So I'm going to start first with saying div. Actually, I'm going to use a UL first. And this will be a great lesson. So I'm going to say 1 inside here, 2, and li 3. So this is an unordered list. UL stands for unordered list. And these stands for li, which are list objects. Let's save this printer. Okay, cool. All right, so I don't know why that's not showing down here. There you go. Weird. So right now this is just an unordered list. I'm going to give this a reset to kind of start this over because you can see that this has a space inside here and it also has these bullets right here. Unordered lists are meant to be like for objects that are more in a list foundation. I use them sometimes for a grid. I just like the object because it has a parent and a child inside of it. But if you're curious about the proper use of using an unordered list versus an ordered list versus other objects, you can Google search them. But if I change this to an OL, you see how there's a counter here, which is kind of handy. So it increments that for me. So if I were to change this to whatever, that's a 4, which is nice. There's also a definition list, which looks very similar to an object list or an unordered list. So object list, unordered list. But I don't want any of that styling. If I didn't know any better, I'm going to guess, though, there's a padding left, and there's a margin top and margin bottom, and then there's a list style on the list items. So if I were to highlight this and go to this object here, go here, UL, and I look here. List style type is disk, margin before and after, which is the WebKit way of doing margin top, margin bottom, and the padding start of left. So that's incorporated to this element. So we're going to reset that. How I'm going to reset that, typically you may want to do something like this. So when I do this, this dots go away. The list style is gone. But it's still indented, so you can see that padding right there in the green. So I say padding left 0. All right. So now this is kind of here, but you can see that orange at the top, meaning that there's a computed margin top and bottom. So I'm going to just do something like this. So now this guy is kind of listed out the same way. Now all I'm left with is this list and these things coming in here. These list items are becoming list items, which makes sense, that's what they are. And then the UL is a block. So I'm going to change how those are actually being structured. Right now I'm doing this on a type selector of UL. This is something I do not want to do. So I'm going to create a class that's called a utility. And this is kind of a weird one. It could either be a utility or it could also be a component. But I'm going to call it a utility list reset. I'm going to create a class here and put that here. So what this allows me to do is if I still wanted a traditional unordered list, I have the flexibility of having that object here, but then also this reset where it removes the list style as well as the padding and the margin above it. So this gives me flexibility so I can use it as it was intended to be used, as well as it gives me this ability to now do additional things to it. So now I have this unordered list that just has the stacking 1, 2, 3. That's not what I want to do. So I'm going to create grid, and it's an object here. So I'm going to call this a grid. So grid right now is doing nothing. If I were to add like an outline, 1 pixel solid red, it'll have a border around this, which will expand the entire thing, which is cool. But that's not what I want to do. What I want to do is I want 1, 2, and 3 to be boxes, and I want them to be next to each other, stacked in a row. There's multiple ways of doing this. I could do something like this, grid. So grid by default is being added to the unordered list. So if I highlight this unordered list, unless you guys have a bad memory or weren't paying attention, you would remember that it is a display block. A display block goes from one side of the screen to the other screen. It expands the width of its parent. So to show you kind of like what that again is, I'm going to say outline 1 pixel solid red from one side to another. Now if I put this in a container, I'm just going to say demo, and I'm going to call demo. I'm going to give it a width of 50%. And I put this guy, this unordered list inside here. The red only goes here. And that's because demo is only a width of 50%, which is 50% of the viewport window here. You probably won't see this. Let's make it 10 so you can really see it. So we have the border here and the red inside there, right? So a block goes from one side to another. So far, are you guys still aligned? Still good here? All right, cool. Because we're about to get crazyville here. I know how Jake loves to get crazy. So with this, we have this unordered object grid. What I could do is something like this, li, and say display inline block. Oops. And we're going to see these guys stack next to each other. To demonstrate this, I'm going to put an outline, 1 pixels, ooh, solid, blue. So each of these have these, but they're next to each other, which is really cool. If I change this to another class, it goes away, they go stacking. And now they're here next to each other. Now, one of the things you'll notice is if you look really closely here, let me examine. Do you see the space in between? An unordered list treats elements as or an inline block treats them as block elements, which block us from one screen to another, but treats them as inline. So an example of an inline, and we talked about this previously, let's do a paragraph, and I'm going to put this inside here. Oops. So we have this paragraph right here. If I were to put a span around ipsum here, and Durham, so I have a span around here. You can't see it, but it is there. A span is an inline computed display type. Now, that doesn't mean much, but they are very incredibly helpful when coming to stylistic things. So if I just wanted to do something like this, span, and say color is red. Now this is going to be red here. Anchors are also inline. Another inline one is something like the I for italic, or M, which is the same thing, which is emphasize, and span here. Now, one of the interesting things about inline block is inline and inline block treat spaces in between. So 1, 2, 3, there's a space in between that. If I wanted to get rid of that space in between these and have them butting up against each other, I would have to do something like this. And there's 3 different hacks that I can do for this. So now there's no, like I can't see this because I've now made the font size 0. But now this li, I'm going to say font size 1 rem. And now we've removed the space in between. They're next to each other. Because what's happening is it's looking at the LIs next to each other and treating them as a space similar to like the space between lorem and ipsum here, and calculating that as it should. So it's nothing wrong with how the computer is computing it. It's how you're writing your code. Now, for example, if I wanted these LIs to be touching each other, I could do this. Same thing. It's the same thing as me doing this. So that's a very important lesson when it comes to display inline block. I would say there's probably developers that have been developing in CSS for 10 years that don't know that. Does that make sense?
Yep.
Cool. Don't sound too excited, everyone. All right. Moving on. All right, so that's one way of getting items next to each other. One of the things why I have this here, I'm going to throw in another UL here. Actually, what I'm going to do is this. So do you see what's happening here? We have all these being outlined, including this child inside here is getting this blue inside. It's because it's got grid. I'm going to get rid of that. But notice that I got rid of O grid here and it's still doing the exact same thing. Why is that? Is because it's saying any LI that's in O grid, treat this way. So this LI is still inside of O grid. So it's inheriting these. And that was the lesson that we talked about in one of the first classes, in the second class, and the third class, or session. This is cool, but this is not my intention. I want them to look like bullets. So let's get rid of this. I have done that, but you see that they're still here. Why this is happening? Again, it's any LI in O grid. CSS is a really weird language. You kind of read from right to left as opposed to left to right. Oops. Sorry. Technical difficulties here. All right, cool. All right, so you read from left to right in CSS. I mean, you read from right to left as opposed to left to right. Meaning that you say you have 1 pixel solid blue as an outline that's inside of an LI. And that's, or in 1 pixel solid blue property that's being applied to an LI that's inside of an O grid. So if you start reading CSS from right to left, it helps you understand like what's actually happening here. So any LI that's inside of an O grid gets this stuff. Now if I said this, any list item that's directly inside of an O grid, you apply this stuff. Now you'll notice that it has these styles inside here, and it is not getting the inline block or the solid blue. The reason for that is, if we look at the selector, it says any LI that is a direct descendant of O grid, apply these CSS properties. So if I look at the CSS over, or the HTML over here, I have O grid. I look at the LI, these list items that are directly inside here, they get these. This guy gets it. But you know what that doesn't get it are these ones, because this is an LI that's in a UL, that's in an LI, that's in an O grid. And that's why they get these. And that's, so any questions on that? And if you guys are wondering, Bandon's going to testify in the Russian probe. Not because I think that's going to be beneficial. I think they just need attention.
Wait, is that official?
Yeah. It's breaking news as of right now.
Oh, wait, are you talking politics?
Yeah, I broke subject. Like I'm multitasking here. I'm actually reading the newspaper.
You like Trump's State of the Union?
Oh, fuck him. Moving onward. Is this making sense about the LIs here?
Yes. The concept makes sense. I don't know if I can do it, but
Well,
I can get it.
all right. So
I'm about to say, man.
So hold on to your butts.
All right.
Hold on to your butt.
Hold on to your butts. That's what he said there. So in this next section, we are going to get really intense in the next 20 minutes. So this is one way of doing it. I'm going to keep this as an example. So I'm just going to call this example 1. Sorry, naming convention that I just broke. And then I'm going to create example 2 here. Which will have this space removed. Oops. Oops. And I'm going to do one more here, just so you can have all these next to each other, so you can see everything that we just talked about. Cool. So this is space in between. These are next to each other because these two pieces are literally touching each other. And then this is, I've removed the spaces in between by making font 0 on this unordered list, and the LIs, increasing the font size back to the default root font size. Now these are all easy examples. Let's go to example 3. Jake, which way am I going to do example 3?
You're gonna do the backwards twist.
All right, so yes, exactly, the backwards twist. Before doing that, I'm going to explain what an after pseudo class is. So let's take this. Let's forget that I've done this here. Let's remove this. I'm going to create a span. Actually, I'm going to create an H1 because that's a header. I'm going to say hello. I'm going to use the type selector and say H1, and I'm going to say after H1, add content. I've now added hello, Jake, as a element after here. Cool. It added a space there. I guess I have to do this. Hello, Jake. Meaning in CSS, I'm mimicking or changing or reflecting the code, and it's only for stylistic purposes. So these are accent pieces that you don't necessarily need to make your interface work, but they extend it for stylistic purposes. They become incredibly beneficial because I can do content blank here, and it's created this blank thing inside here, and I could say a display block, and I could say a width of 1 rem and a height of 1, ooh, if I could spell both of these things. And I could say a border radius of 50%, and I can give it a color of red. And we will have this square here, but I meant to say border radius, and it will be a circle. And now we have a circle afterwards.
What does rem mean again?
So it is a root font size. It is based off of the interpretation of what your browser has from accessibility. By default, the root font size of a browser is 16 pixels for accessibility standards of the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines, which is Web Content Accessibility Guidelines 2.0 or the WCAG. And inside there, the font size for people with disabilities for legibility, the best font size is 16 pixels. On the web, for printed, it is 12 point, which there's a difference between a point and a pixel. But if I look at HTML here and I go to compute and I go to, I don't see it here, I go to show all and I go to font size. It's 16 pixels. So 16 pixels is the default font size. 1 rem means that it is looking at the root of my fonts, meaning the difference between root and M is if I said span, and I put this, let's do the span, hello, inside here. So, let's do this span. If I said all H1s have a font size of 12 pixels, you see how this dot is still the same size, which is actually 16 by 16. So if I highlight over this, I go here and I go after, it will be 16 by 16. Well, 15.99 by 16. Thanks, Chrome. So if I were to say this is M, this will now be 12. So an M versus a root is, it's looking, an M is the parent width, and it's going to change based off this. So if I make this 42 pixels, that circle afterward will be 42 pixels at 1. If I did this as half, this would be 21 by 21. If I did it at rem, if I did half, this would be 8 by 8. If I did it at 1, it would be 16 by 16. If I did it at 2, it would be 32 by 32. And if I change this to 12 pixels, It doesn't matter because it's looking at the root, which is the base font size. Anyways, the before and after is a pseudo class. If I say after versus before, it goes before and after. Yo. Is very powerful. Yo. And I can also do before and after. You can't do two of them. Say hi. Goodbye. Hi, hello, goodbye. So why this is important is in example 3, we're going to use that. Disrupt me if you have questions. Oops. After example 3, I'm going to say after. We're going to come back to that in a second. But before we do that, we're going to say example 3. And for the case of example 3, I'm going to just give it a background color of lime to prove a point here. So it goes across. And then I'm going to say all the LI's direct descendants inside here have a border of 1 pixel solid red. Cool. With that, I'm going to say that they're going to float left. So now they're touching each other. But weird thing is the green went away. The reason the green went away is if I inspect this, the UL actually has a height of 0. Do you see this? It says 1729.46 by 0. But if I look at the LIs here, they all have 20.17 as its height, but the parent is smaller by it. And that's because of a calculation in CSS. Same thing happens also in absolutes. It's just a calculation of heights and width. It's actually very beneficial. I could do probably a 3-hour-long presentation on why CSS calculates that way. But for purposes of today, I'm just going to explain how you clear a float. So again, before I added this float here, it was green. And now the green's gone. Now I could give this a height and say 20 pixels, and you'll see it. But this is actually isn't 20 pixels, it was whatever, 17.9. I could also add an overflow hidden. And now the green's back. Now this works with the exception of one thing. Let's say this, span 3. So you can't see this. But if I said all LIs, all spans that are inside of an LI that are inside example 3 had a margin top of 50 pixels. 3 is going to be gone. Whoa. Should be gone. Oh, I need to give this a display inline-block or block. Margin and padding don't work on inline. And that's why that did not come across. Ooh, did I screw up something here? Give me one quick second. This is literally the first time I've ever written CSS, so I apologize. I'm trying to figure it out. Well, something stupid here. All right, so that's working. Let's give it a position, relative, top. Let's just do this. -50. All right, forget that. Let's just say absolute. Oh, and relative is misspelled. All right, so you see 3 is missing right here. If I said like -5 pixels, you'll see some of it, but it's getting cut off. That's because there's an overflow hidden. This is one way of clearing a float. It is not ideal. This will not work for a menu. So for example, a lot of times you want to clear a float or have things next to each other because you're building out a navigational menu and you want something like about, home, all this stuff. But if you have a drop down side of it, it'll get cut off and you'll never see it. So how to overcome that instead of doing overflow hidden, what we'll do is say this is going to remain background green. We're going to have an after, and I'm going to say a content is equal to blank. And I'm going to say a display. I like to do table here. You can do other ones. I'm going to say a clear both. So now I have this guy here, and this guy, for some reason it's getting cut off here. Do I still have the overflow here? But what this allows me to have is the flexibility of having the content kind of go one way or another and expand outside of the green area here. So do you see how this is going outside the bounds of the green and it's not getting cut off? That would be the same way that like a drop-down menu would work. But if I were to have like overflow hidden here, which is another way to clear a float, those get cut off. And this becomes more noticeable if I were to make this maybe be a little bit bigger. So that's an important lesson of CSS. Now these are left aligned right here. If I wanted to be on the right, I would do right, but they reverse the order. 1, 2, 3, 4. But a common navigation for the most stable way of writing is built this way in CSS. Now let's get into some of the sizes. Let's call this a utility. Let's just call it a size. Call it 100. So now these are all 100 pixels and they're right next to each other. I may also want to have something like a U align center. Text align center. And I separate out my CSS so then I have the ability to do something like this. The middle one's centered, but this one is left aligned, this one's centered, and this one's left aligned. But then I may want to say, you know what? There may be a time where I want it to be left aligned, which is default, but I may need to override it. And I may want to have a line right. So now, if I add this here, I've created almost 3 unique looks with only adding an additional class. So this is one way to create a grid. Now, if I were to multiply this a bunch of times, so I'm just going to copy this. You'll see them kind of stack here based off the browser width. This is the most traditional way of building out a CSS grid. Now, in the last minute here, before we end, I'm going to show you one other quick way of doing it. Or I'm going to be late for my meeting, which I get caught up very easily because this is one of my favorite things to talk about. And my next conversation is my next favorite thing to talk about, which is content management design, if you guys are wondering. All right, so we're going to create example 4. Example 4 is going to be a display table. And then the children inside of it, which are the LI, are going to have a display table cell. So it is treated the exact same way. Exact same kind of result, but different styles. So let's add these here. So now they're both going to have green. And then what we'll do is this. Cool. Last thing here, I'm going to show you one more example. So both of these require the LI, and this is a more modern way, and by more modern way I mean the past 5 years maybe. Display flex, and that's all I need to do. Now there's a lot of calculations that go into what a flex does, and that's really where I want to dive into next week, because that on its own is its own lesson. Because right now we haven't even gotten into the internal widths of these and what those mean and how to calculate them. Oops. So that's 3 different grids that do the exact same thing. Any questions on that?
Nope.
Were you guys lost? And I know it's actually 4 different ways of doing relatively the same thing, because I could apply this width to these guys if I wanted to. Let me do that really quick here. There you go. If you can do these things right here, you can build out almost the majority of the interfaces that you wish and dream to do. Oh. Damn. Cool. So those are display types, some of the positioning, and how to do a display inline block, how to do a float, what was the third one? A table, and a flex grid. Questions?
I mean, I'm totally just going to rewatch the video.
Yeah. Well, I don't know if you guys know this, but the replay of this actually comes across in Spanish. So you'll have to watch my Spanish, Kevin Mack teaches Spanish class first, if you don't know Spanish, and then hopefully that helps you out.
I've been speaking more immersion in Spanish.
Yeah. Was this... and again, like I went through that last piece really quickly. We're going to continue this next week. I know we said 6 sessions, but I would like to continue this to 8 sessions if you guys are happy, if you are okay doing that. Because I feel like we missed one, maybe 2 of them. And this is getting into the core of really understanding CSS. And I'm starting to go through some of these things a little bit quicker. But I hope this is helpful.
Yeah, I like it.
Cool.
Certainly down.
All right. Well, guys, as always, thank you for your time. I'm sorry that I chatted more this time than back and forth, but I will post this video if it all went and recorded well to YouTube. I will send you a text with it, and let's schedule next week via email and text and kind of go from there. If you have any questions whatsoever, please do not hesitate to reach out to me. and I'll help you answer those questions. And if there's something specific that you want to cover next week between now and then, let me know, and I'll make sure to prepare for that and to at least start off with that. Cool?
Cool, sounds good.
All right, everyone. Have a good
All
night.
right.
Bye.
Bye-bye. See ya.
See ya.